The auctioneer had barely opened his mouth when Gilbert Morgan strode forward, dropped a full month's wages on the table, and said he wanted to bid on Helen Quinn's hand for the harvest dance, and the look she gave him could have cured leather. The autumn of 1878 had settled over the town of Harrow Creek, Kansas, the way it always did, slowly, golden and smelling of wood smoke and dried corn. The plain stretched out in every direction like a rumpled quilt someone had tossed across the earth and forgotten to smooth, and the little town sat square in the middle of it all, stubborn and enduring, the way small towns on the frontier tend to be. Harrow Creek had a general store, a blacksmith, a church whose steeple leaned slightly to the east, a saloon that the preacher pretended not to know about, and one hotel that doubled as a boarding house for travelers moving west along the Kishom Trail's northern fork. Every year, without fail, the town held its harvest dance. It was the single most anticipated event on the social calendar, which, admittedly, was not a particularly crowded calendar. There were quilting bees and barn raisings and the occasional traveling medicine show, but none of those had the music, the food, the lantern light, and the charged, hopeful electricity of a harvest night when the crops were in, and the cold hadn't yet fully arrived. The town square was transformed with paper lanterns strung between the oak trees, trestle tables groaning under pies and bread and smoked meats, and a small wooden platform where the musicians old Ezra Hollies on fiddle, his son Marcus on harmonica, and a quiet widow named Mrs. Packard, who played the upright piano they hauled out on a wagon, would play until midnight. And as had been the custom in Harrow Creek for nearly 15 years, the harvest dance included a charity auction. The proceeds went to the town's schoolhouse fund, which was a cause that Reverend Mills championed with considerably more enthusiasm than he applied to his Sunday sermons. The auction worked simply enough. Any unmarried woman in town who wished to participate could offer a single dance, or, in the grander tradition, the first and last dances of the evening, to the highest bidder. The money went to the school fund. The woman was under no obligation beyond the dances themselves. It was wholesome, everyone agreed, and also absolutely everyone knew it. It was the single most revealing social event of the year because a man who bid on a woman in front of the whole town was a man who had made his feelings plain as a Kansas sky. Helen Quinn was 26 years old, and she had lived in Harrow Creek for 3 of those years. She had arrived from St. Louis with her father, a land surveyor named Edmund Quinn, who had come west to work a contract with the Kansas Pacific Railroad, and had stayed because the land beguiled him, and because, as he confessed to Helen one evening over supper, he had grown tired of being crowded. Edmund Quinn was a quiet, thoughtful man with ink-stained fingers and a gentle dignity that the frontier seemed to suit. He had purchased a modest house on the eastern edge of town, taken on surveying work for local ranchers and homesteaders, and built a life that was smaller than what they had left behind in St. Louis, but, Helen privately thought, far more honest. Helen herself had taken a position at the schoolhouse, teaching the children of Harrow Creek their letters and their sums, and when she could manage it, their history and their geography, and a bit of poetry that most of the boys pretended to hate, and then remembered for the rest of their lives. She was a practical woman, Helen Quinn. With strong hands and a direct gaze and dark brown hair she wore pinned up with a discipline that occasionally gave way on windy days to curling wisps around her temples. She had what her father called a forthright nature, and what the older women of Harrow Creek called, in hushed but admiring tones, a spine of iron. She did not suffer fools. She did not pretend to opinions she did not hold. She was, in the estimation of the majority of Harrow Creek's residents, excellent company and a genuine asset to the community, and also, as 3 separate young men had discovered in the preceding years, exceedingly difficult to court. It was not that Helen Quinn did not want to be courted. She had, in fact, thought about it a great deal more than she let on. It was simply that the men who had tried had all made the same fundamental error, which was to assume that what Helen Quinn wanted was to be managed, settled, and reduced to a pleasant domestic arrangement as quickly as possible. She was not interested in being someone's convenient answer to a problem. She was interested in being known, truly known, by someone who found that prospect more exciting than terrifying. She had not yet met that person, and she had, as she told her friend Clara Beaumont one afternoon while they shelled peas on Clara's porch, more or less made her peace with the possibility that she might not. Clara, who was 32 and had been married for 10 years to a good man named Thomas and who understood both the joys and the specific loneliness of frontier marriage better than most, had listened thoughtfully and then said, "Helen, you have not made peace with anything. You are simply very good at sounding like you have." Helen had thrown a pea hull at her for that, and they had both laughed, and the subject had been dropped. But the words had stayed with Helen longer than she would have admitted. Gilbert Morgan had come to Harrow Creek in the spring of 1878, about 6 months before the harvest dance, with a string of 4 horses he intended to sell, a bedroll, a rifle, a saddlebag of personal effects, and very little in the way of stated plans. He was 29, lean in the way that men who have spent years outdoors tend to be lean, not thin but efficient, as though his body had long since shed anything it did not absolutely need. He had dark eyes that caught light in an unexpected way, a jaw that was either strong or stubborn depending on his mood, and a manner that was quiet without being cold. He smiled rarely enough that when he did it registered. He had worked cattle drives since he was 17, coming up out of Texas along the various trail routes that fed the Kansas railheads, and he knew cattle and horses and open country the way some men know books, not just the facts of them but the feel. He had saved enough money over the years to think about something more permanent than driving other men's cattle from one end of the country to the other, and Harrow Creek had caught his attention because old Silas Graft, who owned the livery stable on the north end of town, had mentioned at a trail camp the previous season that he was looking to take on a partner, someone who knew horses and could help him grow the operation. Gilbert had listened, thought it over for about 300 miles, and then turned up in Harrow Creek in April. He and Silas had struck an agreement over coffee and a handshake, and Gilbert had settled into a room at the hotel, taken his meals at the boarding house table, and begun to learn the rhythms of a town he intended to stay in. He had noticed Helen Quinn approximately 11 days after his arrival, which was roughly the amount of time it took before their paths crossed naturally, Harrow Creek being the size it was. She had been standing outside the general store reading a list, frowning at it with an expression of mild but contained frustration, when the wind off the plains had lifted the paper clean out of her hand and sent it skittering across the packed earth of the main street. Gilbert had been walking past, and he had caught the paper before it could roll under the wheel of a passing wagon, and he had brought it back to her. She had looked at him, assessed him in the direct way she had that some people found unnerving and he had found unexpectedly refreshing, and said, "Thank you." He had said, "Yes, ma'am," which was the kind of thing a man says when he is very conscious of the fact that he is holding himself carefully still. She had taken the list, glanced at it to confirm it was intact, and walked into the store. He had stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, aware of something shifting in him like a compass needle finding north, and then gone about his day. In the months that followed, they had, through the natural workings of a small community, become acquainted. They had spoken at Sunday services and at the general store, and at the town square on evenings when the summer heat drove people outside to sit on porches and benches in the hope of catching a breeze. They had spoken at length at a barn raising in July, when the work of the day had given way to food and conversation, and he had told her about the trail drives, and she had told him about St. Louis, and they had discovered, almost simultaneously and with a kind of mutual surprise, that they had both read David Copperfield and held strong and somewhat divergent opinions about several of its characters. That conversation had lasted 2 hours and had been witnessed by approximately half the town, most of whom had drawn the obvious conclusions, and were by August discussing the matter with the comfortable authority of people who consider themselves reliable social observers. Gilbert Morgan, for his part, was aware that he had feelings for Helen Quinn. He was aware of this with a clarity that surprised him, because he was not by nature a person who was given to emotional certainty. He had lived a life that rewarded self-sufficiency and discouraged dependence, and the discovery that he thought about a particular woman with a frequency that bordered on preoccupation was both welcome and slightly alarming. He had not told her this. He was not sure how to tell her this without sounding like a man who had lost his good sense, which he was not entirely certain he had not. What he had done, instead, was show up at the harvest dance with a sum of money that represented roughly 30 days of honest work, and an intention so clear it might as well have been written in the sky. The auction was held at the beginning of the evening, before the dancing proper commenced, and it was presided over by Mayor Herbert Coles, a round and cheerful man who enjoyed any occasion that gave him an excuse to speak at length to a captive audience. The lanterns swayed gently in the early October breeze. The smell of apple cider and roasting corn drifted from the refreshment tables. The whole of Harrow Creek had turned out, dressed in their best, and the crowd had gathered around the small auction platform with the particular energy of people who expect to be entertained. Helen was there because she had promised Clara she would be, and because she had helped plan the event, and because she genuinely believed in the school fund and understood that her participation in the auction was, practically speaking, good for the children of Harrow Creek, and not actually the ordeal she had told herself it was going to be. She was wearing a deep green dress that had been her good dress in St. Louis and was still, through the miracle of careful maintenance, her good dress in Harrow Creek. Her hair was up properly this time, and she had borrowed a pair of Clara's good earrings, small amber drops that caught the lantern light. She stood near the edge of the crowd with Clara beside her and her father a few paces away, talking to the blacksmith about something that had to do with a survey dispute. When Mayor Coles called her name, she walked to the platform with the measured composure she brought to most public occasions. She stood straight, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, and faced the crowd with an expression that was pleasant and entirely neutral, and she waited. The bidding started at $2, which was where it always started. A young man named Robert Ellis, who worked at the feed store and had been trying to work up the nerve to speak to Helen for the better part of 6 months, managed to get out $3 before turning red and going silent. Another bid came from the back of the crowd, $4 from a rancher's son named Gerald Pete, who had no particular interest in Helen specifically, but liked to participate. The bids moved slowly upward in the way they usually did, and Helen stood with patient composure and thought about the fact that she had left a book at home that she was rather looking forward to returning to. Then Gilbert Morgan walked to the table at the front of the platform where you placed your bid, and he laid down a folded collection of bills without particular ceremony, and Mayor Coles counted them out with widening eyes and declared that the bid was $15.40. The crowd went quiet in the way that crowds do when something unexpected has occurred, and everyone is trying to absorb it before they react. $15 was not an insignificant amount of money in Harrow Creek in 1878. It was a week's wages for many men. It was, for the purposes of a charity dance auction, a sum that communicated something well beyond civic generosity. Helen looked at Gilbert Morgan. He was standing at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hand, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was steady and open, and she thought, slightly terrified, which she found oddly endearing even in the midst of her alarm. Mayor Coles cleared his throat. "Do I hear $16? Any further bids?" Silence. Then the first and last dances of the evening go to Mr. Gilbert Morgan, for the magnificent sum of $15.40, which will be added to our school fund with gratitude." He beamed at the crowd, and the crowd erupted in the kind of appreciative noise that people make when they have been given something to talk about. Helen stepped down from the platform, and Gilbert Morgan fell into step beside her because the social mechanics of the moment required it, and because he wanted to, and Helen turned to him and said, in a voice that was level and quiet enough that only he could hear it, "Mr. Morgan, you have just spent $15.40 on 2 dances with a woman who does not particularly want to be danced with. That is a considerable waste of good money." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "I expect you to tell me that you are right, ma'am, and I am prepared for it, but I thought I would take the chance anyway." She studied him. He held his ground under that study, which she noted, because most men did not. "The school fund thanks you," she said finally, and walked toward the refreshment table, and he walked beside her, and that was how the evening began. The dancing did not start for another half-hour, which meant there was time first for food and the particular commerce of small-town social occasions, introductions and inquiries about harvests and health and the state of the roads. Gilbert walked beside Helen through these exchanges, with a quietness that she found herself noticing, because it was not the quietness of a man who had nothing to say, but the quietness of a man who was choosing to listen. She introduced him to her father, which she had done briefly before at Sunday services but not at any length, and the 2 men shook hands and Edmund Quinn looked at Gilbert with the attentive consideration of a man whose work required him to take careful measurements of things. "I hear you are going into partnership with Silas Graft," Edmund said. "That is the plan," Gilbert said. "He knows the business well. I know horses. We seem to complement each other's gaps." "A good basis for a partnership," Edmund said, "and for most other things." He looked at Helen when he said it, and Helen looked at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who is choosing not to engage with a particular conversational implication. Gilbert noticed, and said nothing, and accepted the cup of cider that Clara Beaumont appeared at his elbow to offer him, Clara being the kind of woman who understood the social utility of a timely cup of something, and deployed it with precision. "She is not as unmoved as she appears," Clara said to him pleasantly, in a tone that suggested she was simply making general conversation about the weather or the state of the harvest. "Clara," Helen said. "I was speaking to Mr. Morgan about the autumn air," Clara said. "It is quite something, isn't it? Brisk but not cold, the kind of evening that makes a person feel as though things are possible." Gilbert looked at Helen, who was looking at Clara with an expression that combined affection and exasperation in equal measure. "It is a fine evening," he said. When the music started, and Mayor Coles announced that the first dances were to begin, Gilbert offered Helen his hand with the formal courtesy that the occasion demanded. She looked at his hand for a moment, and he thought she might refuse, and she did not. She placed her hand in his and let him lead her to the open area of the square where the dancing was happening, and they joined the set that was forming for a quadrille. The dance required them to be apart as much as together, moving through the figures with the other couples, and for the first several minutes they spoke only the brief necessary words that the figures demanded: a direction, a step, a turn. But at a moment when the pattern brought them together and briefly held them there, she said, "Why, $15.40, he said. "It was all I had with me." She looked at him. "You brought every cent you had to a harvest dance auction." "I brought everything I thought I might need," he said, which was not quite the same thing, and she heard the difference. The figure moved them apart again. When the quadrille ended and the musicians shifted to a slower tune, couples reorganized themselves, and Gilbert stayed at her side with the calm certainty of a man who knew where he was supposed to be. He offered his hand again. She took it again, and this time the dance held them closer, and there was no evading the simple physical fact of his nearness. She was aware of the smell of him, clean cotton and leather and something warmer beneath that, and she was aware of his hand at her back, firm and steady without being presumptuous, and she was aware that she was comfortable in a way she had not expected to be and was not quite sure what to do with. "You read David Copperfield," she said. because she wanted to say something that put them on familiar ground. "I have read most things I could get my hands on," he said. "Trail drives are long and winters are longer. And you argue for Micawber's essential decency even in the face of his failures," she said. "I remember your reasoning. You said that a man is not the worst version of himself." "I believe that," he said, "even when the evidence is considerable, especially then," he said. "If a man is only given credit when the evidence is clear, that is not really faith, it is just accounting." She was quiet for a step or two. "That is an unexpectedly generous philosophy for a man who has spent 12 years on cattle drives," she said. "That is not generally considered a context that produces optimists. It produces realists," he said. "There is a difference. A realist sees things as they are, which includes the possibility that they might be better than they currently are." She looked up at him then, actually up at him, because he was taller than her, and she found that his expression matched his words, not performative, not attempting to impress her, simply honest. It was the quality she had sensed in him since that first day with the paper list, the quality she had been testing in small ways across their months of acquaintance, and it was holding. "You are not what I anticipated," she said, which for Helen Quinn was a statement of considerable significance. "What did you anticipate?" he asked. "Someone who bid $15 on a dance because he wanted to make a point in public," she said. "I did want to make a point," he said, "but not in the way you mean. I was not performing for the town. I was just tired of not having said anything." She held that for a moment, feeling the weight of it. "And what is it you have said?" He looked at her steadily. "That I think about you with a frequency that has become difficult to account for on any basis other than the obvious one, and that I would like very much to have the chance to know you better if you are willing to allow it." It was not poetry. It was not the kind of elaborate rhetoric that she had occasionally heard from men who had read too many dime novels and confused flourish for feeling. It was plain and true, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that in the slight tension along his jaw, the careful steadiness of his eyes. He was not a man who said things like this easily. He was saying it anyway. The music drifted to its end, and they stood for a moment in the relative stillness between songs. "You are not what I anticipated," she said again, and this time it was unmistakably not a complaint. They spent the rest of the evening in the way of people who have cracked open a door and are not yet ready to walk through it but cannot quite bring themselves to close it either. They talked. They listened to the music. They ate apple cake at one of the trestle tables and disagreed productively about whether the railroad was ultimately going to be good for a town like Harrow Creek. He thought it would bring growth, and she thought growth was a word that covered a great deal of complicated ground. And neither of them changed the other's mind, but both of them came away feeling oddly satisfied by the exchange. Clara watched from across the square and said nothing to her husband Thomas beyond a quiet, "well," which Thomas understood to mean that Clara was satisfied with the way things were developing and was reserving further commentary for Helen's ears alone. When the last dance was called, Gilbert offered his hand and Helen took it, and they moved through the slow final waltz with the kind of ease that comes from 2 hours of gradual calibration, learning the rhythm of each other's movement, the slight adjustments that keep two people from stepping on each other, literal and otherwise. The lanterns had burned lower and the crowd had thinned slightly, and the night had gotten properly cool in the way October nights on the Kansas plains eventually must, and Helen was aware of being warm in the circle of the dance despite it. When the music stopped for the last time and the evening began to dissolve into departures and good nights, Gilbert walked with her to where her father was standing, and shook Edmund Quinn's hand, and said good night to her with a formality that was not coldness but respect, and she watched him walk off into the lantern light and the autumn dark, and thought that she had made an error somewhere, and was not yet sure of its exact nature. She thought that the error might have been in letting herself enjoy the evening quite so much as she had. The following days were the kind of quiet days that feel charged from the inside regardless of how ordinary they appear from the outside. Helen taught her classes with her usual focused attention and came home in the afternoons to grade her papers at the kitchen table, while her father worked at his survey maps spread across the sitting room floor. And in the evenings, they ate supper together and talked about their days in the comfortable shorthand of people who have learned to inhabit the same space with genuine regard for each other. She did not mention Gilbert Morgan, and her father did not ask, which was in itself a kind of conversation. On the third day after the harvest dance, she was walking home from school along the main street when she heard her name spoken and turned to find Gilbert falling into step beside her. He had been at the livery, which was evident from the state of his sleeves, which he had rolled to the elbows in a way that she noticed more than she had intended to notice. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I wanted to ask if you might consider taking a walk on Sunday after services, if you are inclined." She looked at him. "A walk," she said. "Along the river path," he said. "It is a pleasant walk this time of year. The cottonwoods have turned." "I am aware of the cottonwoods," she said, because the river path was something she walked frequently, and the cottonwoods in October were one of her genuine pleasures. "I would not take much of your time," he said, "only as much as you wish to give." She stopped walking and turned to face him properly. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "I think you should understand something. 3 men have attempted to court me in the past 3 years. Each of them assumed that what I wanted from a courtship was to reach its conclusion as quickly as possible. I found that exhausting and irritating and ultimately insulting. If you are asking to walk with me because you have decided you need a wife and I am a reasonable candidate and you want to have the business settled before winter, you will save us both a great deal of time by saying so now." He was quiet for a moment. "That is not why I am asking," he said. "Why, then?" "Because I enjoy talking to you," he said. "Because I spent 2 hours arguing with you about the railroad at a harvest dance, and it was the most interesting conversation I have had in 2 years. Because I would like more of that if you are willing. That is all I am asking for." She studied him. A wagon rolled past on the street and sent up a small cloud of dust, and she narrowed her eyes against it. "The cottonwoods are very fine this time of year," she said. "They are," he said. "I will walk with you on Sunday," she said. "After services, I will need to let my father know." "Of course," he said. She walked on, and he did not follow, which she appreciated, and she arrived home in a state of interior commotion that she translated, for her father's benefit, into a level and matter-of-fact account of the invitation and her acceptance. Edmund Quinn looked up from his survey maps. He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention he reserved for measurements that mattered. "Is that so?" he said. "It is so," she said, and went to put the kettle on and said no more about it. The Sunday walk was everything the cottonwoods had promised it would be. The river path followed the course of a narrow tributary that wound along the eastern edge of town, shaded in summer and glorious in fall, the ground layered with fallen yellow leaves that crunched pleasantly underfoot. The morning services had ended, and the town was in the Sunday state of quiet activity, families walking home, children released from formality, the occasional horse standing patiently outside a building, whose occupant had not yet concluded whatever indoor business Sunday permitted. They walked along the river path, and they talked the way they had at the harvest dance and at the barn raising, and at every occasion when they had found themselves in each other's proximity, easily, without the performance that social convention often demanded. She told him about a student of hers, a 10-year-old boy named Eli Graft, who was Silas Graft's grandson, and who had a gift for numbers that exceeded anything she knew how to teach him. Gilbert said he had noticed the boy around the livery, that he had a steady way with horses already, and that he had the look of someone who was going to be better at everything than the people around him, and was going to have to learn to carry that gracefully. "You said that about a 10-year-old, she said. "I said it because I meant it," he said. "I was that child, more or less. Good at the things that were valued on a cattle drive, which was useful, but it created its own complications." "What kind of complications?" she asked. He was quiet for a step. "Men who feel outpaced by someone younger take it personally," he said. I had to learn when to be less visible about what I knew. It took a while. And did you resent it, having to dim yourself? He considered this with the seriousness she had learned to expect from him. For a time, he said, and then I realized that the knowledge was still there whether or not I displayed it, and that protecting it mattered less than using it well. He paused. That is also a longer answer than you probably needed. I asked a long question, she said. He smiled. It was the rare smile, the one that rearranged his face into something unexpectedly warm, and she felt it catch somewhere in her chest in a way that she acknowledged to herself with the honesty she applied to most things. They walked for an hour and then sat on a fallen log near a bend in the river and watched the light on the water, and the conversation moved from his years on the trail to her years in St. Louis, to her mother, who had died when Helen was 16, to his family in Texas, whom he had not seen in several years, and about whom he spoke with a complicated quietness that she did not press but held gently in mind. "Do you miss Texas?" she asked. "I miss what I thought it was when I was young," he said. "What it actually is I carry with me, I think." She looked at him. "That is a very honest answer." "I try to be honest," he said. "I am not always successful, but I try." "What do you fail to be honest about?" He looked at the river for a moment. "Myself mostly," he said. "What I want. I have spent a long time not saying things, and it has become a habit that takes effort to break." She thought of the harvest dance, of $15.40 laid on a table in front of the whole town. "You seem to be breaking it," she said. He looked at her then directly and said, "I am trying." The weeks that followed had a shape and a sweetness that Helen had not anticipated. They walked together on Sundays and talked over the fence outside the schoolhouse on afternoons when he came into town from the livery, and she was still tidying after the children had gone. She brought him a book one week, a collection of essays she thought he would argue with productively, and he returned it with 3 pages of notes tucked inside, written in a clear, careful hand, and she sat with those pages at her kitchen table and felt something she recognized as happiness, simple and uncomplicated, which was the rarest kind. Her father approved of Gilbert Morgan with a quiet steadiness that said more than elaboration would have. Edmund Quinn had a surveyor's eye for the gap between the map and the territory, the difference between what a thing looked like and what it measured out to be, and when he measured Gilbert Morgan, he found that the measurements were consistent and the ground was solid, and he said as much to Helen one evening in the oblique way he had of offering her his assessments. "He listens when you talk," Edmund said. "Not the way men listen when they are waiting for their turn. The way you listen when something matters." Helen said, "I had noticed that." "Good," Edmund said. He turned back to his maps. "I thought you would." November arrived with its particular gray beauty, the sky gone the color of old pewter, and the wind off the plains carrying real cold now, the kind that found every gap in a coat or a wall. The town of Harrow Creek pulled in slightly as it always did in winter, fewer people on the street, more fires lit earlier in the day, a kind of drawing together that was less loneliness than the honest acknowledgement that warmth was something to be shared. At the livery, Gilbert and Silas Graft had been doing steady work preparing horses for winter, taking in 2 animals that had belonged to a homesteader who had finally given up on his claim north of town and headed back east, and contracting with a rancher named Buckley who ran cattle some miles out and needed reliable horse trading connections for the coming year. The partnership was working as Gilbert had hoped it would. Silas knew the town and the relationships and the history, and Gilbert knew the animals and the trade, and together they were building something that felt, to Gilbert's careful estimation, like the foundation of a life. He thought about this as he worked, about foundations, about what a life you built yourself felt like compared to one you fell into or were handed, and he thought about Helen Quinn with a frequency that had long since ceased to surprise him, and had settled into something that felt more like a constant awareness, the way you are always aware of the horizon when you have lived long enough on open ground. On a cold Thursday in late November, He came to the schoolhouse after the children had left and found Helen standing at the window looking out at the gray afternoon, with an expression that was thoughtful in a way that had something subdued underneath it. And he said, "Are you all right?" She turned. "I am," she said, and then after a pause, "My father is not well, nothing serious, the doctor thinks. A chest cold that has gone deeper than it should have. He is resting. I am just thinking." He took his hat off. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, not the politely rhetorical version of the question, but the actual version. "About how alone things feel when someone you love is fragile," she said. "And about the fact that I am being quite dramatic for a chest cold that the doctor has said he expects to resolve. It is not dramatic to be affected by the people who matter to you," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose it is not." She straightened slightly. "I have been meaning to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "The night of the harvest dance when I said you were wasting good money," she said. "I was not entirely honest." He waited. "I was protecting myself," she said, "which is a habit of mine that I am not entirely proud of because it is often indistinguishable from being unkind, and you did not deserve unkindness." He was very still, the way he got when something mattered. "You do not need to apologize to me, Helen." It was the first time he had used her given name without the preceding miss, and both of them heard it in the slight pause that followed, a door opening another inch. "I know I do not need to," she said. "I want to. There is a difference." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which she had learned over the past weeks was something he gave carefully and completely and not by halves. "I was not offended," he said. "I have thought about that night a great deal. And I think that you said what you said because the situation was public and sudden, and I put you in a position where any response you gave was going to be interpreted by half the town before you had a chance to have an opinion of your own. That was my fault." "You were trying to say something," she said. "I was trying to say it in the least terrifying way I could think of," he said. "Which in retrospect was perhaps not the most successful approach." She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite social laugh she sometimes deployed, but the actual one, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere definitive. "It was not the worst approach," she said. "I am glad to hear it," he said. Her father's cold worsened over the following days before it began to improve. And in that difficult interval Gilbert Morgan appeared at the Quinn house on the second day, with a covered pot of soup, made at the boarding house kitchen with the cooperation of Mrs. Hannigan, who ran the boarding house and had a theory that her beef broth could address most ailments short of a broken bone. He appeared again on the fourth day with firewood, because he had noticed when he called the previous time that their wood supply was getting low, and he had split and stacked enough to carry them well into December without being asked, and without making a performance of it. Helen had stood on the porch watching him stack the wood and felt something settle in her chest, something that had been braced against possibility and was no longer quite bracing. She had brought him coffee afterward, and they had sat on the porch wrapped in their coats despite the cold, and talked about nothing of particular consequence. The town, the weather, the fact that Eli Graft had apparently solved a long division problem that Helen had set for the older students as a challenge, and done it in his head, and the ordinary comfort of it was so complete that she had to look away from him for a moment to collect herself. Edmund Quinn improved, as the doctor had predicted, and was back at his survey table by early December, though moving somewhat more carefully than usual, and accepting his daughter's insistence that he keep a fire through the night with a graciousness that suggested the illness, had gently rearranged certain of his habitual stubbornnesses. He knew what Gilbert Morgan had done during those days, because Helen had told him in the factual, unembellished way she reported things she was moved by, and he said nothing about it except to remark one evening that a man who shows up with firewood without being asked tends to show up in most other situations too. Helen said she had reached similar conclusions. Edmund nodded and went back to his maps. Christmas in Harrow Creek was a modest affair by the standards of anywhere with a larger population or a longer settled history, but it had its own dignities. A candlelight service at the church, a communal dinner in the town hall to which everyone contributed and everyone was invited, a few strings of dried berries and paper decorations in the windows, and a general atmosphere of deliberate warmth against the dark and the cold. Helen sat with Gilbert at the communal dinner, beside her father and across from Clara and Thomas Beaumont and their two boys, and the table was loud with conversation and the smell of roasted meat and warm bread. And at one point, Gilbert said something in a low voice only to her that made her laugh. And across the table, Clara caught Thomas's eye with the expression of someone who has been right about something for quite some time. After the dinner, as people were collecting coats and making their way home through the cold, clear night, Gilbert and Helen walked together in the direction of the Quinn house, their breath visible in the frozen air, the stars overhead enormous and indifferent and beautiful. They had walked in this direction together many times by now, but this night had a different quality, the kind of quality that settles over an evening when both people involved know that something is drawing to a conclusion and are not certain which of them is going to name it. They stopped at the Quinn gate, which was the natural place to stop, and the silence between them was the particular silence of people who have been talking for months and have arrived at the place where words become insufficient for what they are trying to say. "Helen," he said. She looked up at him. The cold had put color in her cheeks and the starlight was enough to see by just barely. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "Not a walk here or a conversation there. I mean formally. With your father's knowledge and the town's knowledge and whatever comes of it, we face as we find it." He paused. "I am not asking you to decide anything else right now. Only whether you will allow me to try." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the plains and found them at the gate, and she felt the cold of it and stood in it steadily. "I think," she said, "that you have been courting me properly since October, and I have been letting you. The question of whether I will allow it has been answered for quite some time." He was still. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a yes," she said. "It has been a yes for longer than I was prepared to say it out loud, which is my own fault and I own it." He reached out and took her hand, which they had not done outside of dancing, and she looked at their joined hands in the cold and dark and felt the warmth of it run up her arm. "Good night, Helen," he said. "Good night, Gilbert," she said, and she said his name like she meant it. The winter months that followed were the months of a courtship conducted with honesty and care, and the particular pleasure of two people who are not in a hurry because they have decided what they want, and the wanting feels good. Edmund Quinn gave his formal blessing with a brevity and sincerity that made Gilbert's throat tighten slightly, because Edmund looked at him when he said it, and what was in his eyes was not approval exactly but recognition, the acknowledgement of one man by another that what he was asking for was the most important thing there was. They read books together, working through a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that had come in with a delivery of goods from the East, and which Helen owned and Gilbert borrowed in installments, returning each section with the 3 pages of notes in the careful hand that she kept in a box. They argued about Dorothea with a pleasurable intensity that satisfied something in both of them. He said Dorothea wanted too much. She said Dorothea wanted exactly the right amount, and the problem was the world she was in. They never fully agreed, but the argument refined over time into something that was more like a duet than a debate. He met her at the schoolhouse gate on Fridays with an apple for her from the general store's supply, which was a small thing so consistent that it became a landmark of the week. She brought food to the livery on cold mornings when she knew he had been there since dawn, biscuits wrapped in cloth, coffee in a jar. Silas Graft accepted these deliveries with a diplomacy that suggested he had been hoping for exactly this development, and was glad to see it progressing satisfactorily. In February, a difficulty arose. It was not a catastrophe, as difficulties in the Wild West sometimes are, not violence, not disease, Not any of the sudden irreversible things that the frontier periodically delivered, but it had weight. A man named Callum Hare arrived in Harrow Creek on a Thursday with a letter and a claim. He was a land speculator from Topeka, and he had paperwork that he said demonstrated a lien on the property adjoining Edmund Quinn's land, the small pasture that Edmund had been using as a surveying base, and which he had believed was clear since purchasing the house 3 years prior. Edmund Quinn reviewed the papers carefully and went pale, and then went very still in the way of a man who is choosing his response with deliberate control. The lien, if valid, would not take Edmund's house, but it would complicate several of his survey contracts and required resolution before he could proceed with spring work. He hired the town's single lawyer, a measured man named Cornelius Webb, who began reviewing the records. Gilbert heard about it from Helen on a Saturday and spent the following week quietly working through his own resources. He had, it turned out, a particular kind of knowledge that was useful here. In his years on cattle drives, he had spent 2 seasons working for a ranching operation in Oklahoma that had been embroiled in a land dispute. And he had, out of necessity and the habit of paying attention, learned a great deal about how lien claims were structured and what made them valid or not. He brought what he knew to Cornelius Webb one afternoon with the clear statement that he was not a lawyer, and this was not legal advice, but Webb might find the information on territorial land records procedures useful. Webb, who was a practical man, accepted this with thanks and used it, and within 3 weeks had found the procedural error in Hare's claim that rendered it invalid under Kansas territorial statute. The lien was discharged. Edmund Quinn came to the livery personally to tell Gilbert, which was an unusual thing for Edmund to do, and which Gilbert understood was not just a report of news. They shook hands and Edmund said, "I do not know exactly what you said to Webb, but he tells me your instinct pointed him in the right direction." "I had some experience with similar situations," Gilbert said. Edmund looked at him. "You are a useful man to have close," he said. It was said simply, without ceremony, and it meant what it meant. Helen heard this account from her father and said nothing to Gilbert about it for 2 days, letting it settle. And then she went to the livery on a Friday afternoon with the biscuits and coffee, and Silas had the good sense to find something to do in the far corner of the building, and she stood in front of Gilbert and said, "You went to Webb about my father's land claim." "I had some relevant information," he said. "You spent a week tracking down relevant information that you then carried to a lawyer on my father's behalf without being asked, and without saying anything to me about it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I did not want to worry you before I knew it would help," he said. She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in front of her, and then she said, "I have been waiting a very long time for someone who does things without needing to be applauded for them." He said nothing, just held her gaze. "Thank you," she said, "for my father and for not making it a performance." "It was not a performance," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly what I mean." March came in with rain and mud and the first tentative green, the ground recovering from the cold with that particular prairie resilience that always struck Helen as something to be admired. The way the grass came back without ceremony, just quietly insisting on being there. She taught her spring sessions with an energy that her students noticed. They were better behaved, Clara later observed, when their teacher was happy, because happiness has a quality of authority that no amount of sternness can replicate. Eli Graft, the number-gifted grandson of Silas, had begun to stop by the livery after school and sit with Gilbert when Gilbert was working, asking questions with the focused curiosity of a child who intends to understand things rather than simply know them. Gilbert answered with the same focused honesty. Helen watched this from a distance and felt something she recognized as love, not just for the man but for the quality of him, the way he treated a 10-year-old with the same seriousness he would give to any adult question worth answering. In April, on a warm afternoon with the smell of the first grass coming through every open window, Gilbert came to the Quinn house in the evening after supper when the light was still long. Edmund Quinn, with a discretion so precisely timed that Helen suspected it had been arranged, discovered urgent business with his survey maps in the back of the house. Helen and Gilbert sat on the porch steps the way they had through the winter, but the cold was gone now and the evening was gentle and gold, and after a while the ordinary conversation trailed off and he turned to look at her with the full weight of his attention, the kind that had become familiar and still had not lost its effect. "Helen," he said, "I would like to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. It was said with the directness that was entirely him, no elaborate preamble, no theater, just the words and their full meaning. "I am not asking because it is expected or because it is time or because the town has an opinion about it. I am asking because being with you has made every day of the past 6 months the best version of what a day can be, because I cannot imagine going back to the version of my life that did not include you in it, and because I would like to spend the rest of what I am given trying to deserve the faith you have had in me." She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it in the objective way she thought about most important things, laying out the considerations and the uncertainties and the shape of what she was choosing. And she had found, every time she did, that she was not afraid. That the prospect of marrying Gilbert Morgan did not feel like a reduction of her life, but an expansion of it, in the direction she had always privately hoped for and told herself was perhaps unlikely. She looked at him. The evening light was very warm, and the horses in the pasture at the edge of town were visible as dark shapes against the gold, and somewhere in the cottonwoods by the river a bird was doing something persistent and musical. "I would like that very much," she said. "Yes." He reached over and took both of her hands in his, the way he had taken one hand on the December night at the gate, and the warmth of it was something she thought she could live inside indefinitely. They sat there on the porch steps for a long time in the golden evening, not talking particularly, just being in the fact of it, and the bird in the cottonwoods kept singing. Edmund Quinn emerged from his ostensible map work after a notably convenient interval, assessed the expression on his daughter's face and the closeness of the two figures on his porch steps, and went very quietly back inside to find a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for an appropriate occasion and pour 3 glasses. The wedding was held in June. It was a Saturday, the kind of Kansas June day that comes in warm and clear and stays golden all the way to the evening, and Reverend Mills performed the ceremony in the church, whose steeple still leaned slightly to the east, which Helen had always thought gave it a character that a perfectly vertical steeple would have lacked. Clara Beaumont stood with Helen and wept with the honest thoroughness of a woman who has been invested in a particular outcome for quite some time. Silas Graft stood with Gilbert and managed to stay composed through most of the ceremony. Edmund Quinn walked his daughter down the aisle with a gravity and a grace that said everything he was too moved to speak, and when he placed her hand in Gilbert's, the look that passed between the two men was brief and complete. Helen wore a dress she and Clara had made together over the preceding weeks, cream-colored cotton with blue ribbon at the cuffs and collar, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers from the river path, the same path she had walked with Gilbert on that first Sunday when the cottonwoods were gold and they were just beginning. She stood at the altar and looked at Gilbert Morgan, who was looking back at her with an expression so open and undefended that she felt it like a physical warmth. And she thought that the woman who had stood on the Harvest dance platform in October and said he was wasting good money had been both right and very wrong, and the wrongness was the better thing. They said their vows with the direct simplicity that suited them both. When the Reverend declared them married, and Gilbert kissed her for the first time in front of the entire assembled community of Harrow Creek, the eruption of approval from the crowd was so emphatic that Reverend Mills had to call for order with more authority than he usually deployed. The reception was held in the town square, the same square where they had danced in October, and someone had put up lanterns in the same oak trees, And old Ezra Hollies and his son Marcus played with a joy that made the music feel like it was happening for the first time in the history of the world. Gilbert and Helen danced the first dance together, and this time there was no auction, no public gesture, no performance. Only two people who had decided on each other moving together in the evening light, and it was quiet and private even in the middle of the crowd, the way things between two people who truly know each other are always their own. Clara danced with Thomas and whispered to him, "I told you," and Thomas said, "You did tell me," with the affectionate patience of a man who is always being told things by his wife and is almost always glad he was. The summer settled around their new life with a warmth that felt earned. They lived in the Quinn house initially, all three of them, Edmund having made it clear that he was not being displaced and had several rooms that were not being used, and that the arrangement was practical, and he was comfortable with it, and that was the end of the matter. It was, in fact, fine. Gilbert had grown up in a household with more people than space, and had a talent for quiet coexistence that Helen found admirable. Edmund and Gilbert established a companionable rhythm of morning coffee and evening conversation, and a mutual respect for each other's working silences that made the house feel, more fully than it had for some time, like a family. The livery partnership with Sela's deepened through the summer as the business grew. The Buckley Ranch contract expanded. 2 other ranchers west of town came on as regular clients. Gilbert bought 2 more horses, good ones for resale, and sold them at a profit in August to a man from Dodge City who had ridden through and recognized quality. He was, by the standards of Harrow Creek and by his own careful accounting, building something real. Helen taught through the summer in the additional sessions. She had begun offering for the older children and the handful of adults who wanted to learn to read and write, something she had proposed to the school board in spring, and gotten approved after a presentation that the board later described as convincing in the way that a strong current is convincing. Among her evening students was a young woman named Maria Vasquez, who had come to Harrow Creek with her husband Miguel, a skilled carpenter who had gotten work with several of the town's building projects, and who wanted to read English fluently enough to help her children learn. Helen taught her with patience and pleasure, and they became, in the way of women who find genuine ease in each other's company, friends. In September, a year after the harvest dance, Helen told Gilbert one morning in the kitchen, with her coffee cup held in both hands and her eyes steady on his, that they were going to have a child. She said it simply, the way she said most things, but her voice had something layered under the simplicity, something soft and enormous. He was standing at the window, and he turned and looked at her for a moment in which the world appeared to reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. And then he crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her forehead. And she closed her eyes, and they stayed like that for a moment in the morning light. Edmund Quinn, when told, set down his coffee very carefully on the survey table and sat quietly for a full minute, and then looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has been given back something he had not known he was missing. "Your mother would have been glad," he said, and Helen went and put her arms around her father, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was needed. The pregnancy progressed well through the autumn. Helen continued teaching until December, when the combination of winter cold and the later stages of expecting made the daily walk to the schoolhouse inadvisable on the worst days, though on good days she still went because the children needed their teacher, and the alternative was staying home and being restless, which suited her disposition poorly. Gilbert watched over her with a care that was not smothering, because he had always understood the difference between protection and control. He was there, consistently, the way he had always been there, at the wood pile before she could think about it, at the gate with the apple that had become a small continuous tradition, beside her in the evenings while they read by the lamp. They talked about the child in the evenings, names, hopes, the kind of people they wanted to be as parents. He wanted to give the child the thing he had not had in plenty, which was the sense that the world was navigable and their own particular self was equal to it. She wanted to give the child the thing her mother had given her, the sense that one's own mind was a worthy companion for a lifetime. They found that these were not competing ambitions. On a cold February morning in 1880, their son was born. He came into the world in the Quinn house with the doctor and Clara Beaumont in attendance, and he arrived with an emphatic announcement of his presence that was audible to Gilbert, who was in the sitting room with Edmund Quinn and Thomas Beaumont, and a cold fireplace they had forgotten to keep fed. He was a healthy, loud, properly proportioned boy, and Helen held him afterward with the exhausted wonder of someone who has just survived something enormous and is still taking stock of its dimensions. Gilbert was allowed in after a while, and he came to where she was propped against the pillows and looked at this small, furious person she was holding and then looked at her. And she had never seen his face quite like that, not the steady, careful look, not the rare, warm smile, but something rower and realer than either, something that was simply love without the container of any expression that had come before it. "Hello," he said, to both of them equally. They named him Edmund James Morgan. Edmund Quinn, upon being told that the boy would carry his name as a first name, went outside to the back of the house for about 10 minutes, which was his version of being moved to tears in private, and came back composed and poured everyone a measure of the celebration whiskey. Little Edmund, from his earliest weeks, had an opinion about everything. He cried with purpose and slept with commitment and looked at the world with wide, dark eyes that held, even at that tender age, what his grandfather called a notable intensity. He was, by all available evidence, going to be a person who required the full attention of any room he was in. The winter of 1880 was a cold one but not a cruel one, and the house was warm and full in a way that houses are when there is a new person in them who has not yet learned to be quiet. Helen recovered her strength with the practical efficiency she brought to most physical challenges, and by spring she was back at the schoolhouse, with little Edmund in the care of Edmund Sr., who turned out to be an unexpectedly devoted and competent grandfather, which surprised no one who had paid close attention to the quiet care with which he had raised Helen. Maria Vasquez had by that spring achieved a fluency in written English that she was genuinely proud of, and she began reading to her own children in both languages, which Helen considered one of the finest outcomes of the evening classes. Maria also, around this time, began helping Helen on the days when Edmund Sr. was occupied with survey work and couldn't watch the baby, bringing her own youngest child along and managing both children with a serene competence that made Helen feel both grateful and mildly awed. The harvest dance of 1880 arrived in October as it always did, and the town gathered in the square with the lanterns and the trestle tables and old Ezra Hollies's fiddle, and Helen and Gilbert walked in together with little Edmund in the carry wrap Helen had learned from Maria and which was, she had found, the most useful piece of equipment she owned. Mayor Coles, spotting them, said to the general crowd with the cheerful authority of someone narrating events he feels personally responsible for, "I believe this time last year our school fund was enriched by $15.40 due to the determination of one of our better citizens." There was laughter and acknowledgement from the crowd, the warm kind that communities give to stories they have already made part of their shared treasury. Helen looked at Gilbert beside her, and he looked back at her with the rare smile, and she thought of the woman on that platform in her green dress who had said he was wasting good money with the brisk conviction of someone who was not at all sure what she believed, and was saying the certain thing instead of the true one. "You were not wasting it," she said to him quietly. He said, "I know." She said, "I should have said so sooner." He said, "You said it in time." They danced that evening in the same square under the same lanterns. Little Edmund passed to Clara's willing arms for the duration, and the music was the same, and the autumn smell was the same, and the cottonwoods were gold along the river, and everything was different, which is the particular miracle of ordinary life when it is being lived fully. The years that settled in after that had the texture of real things, which is to say they were not uniformly golden, but were consistently good in the ways that matter. The livery grew until Silas Graft retired his daily share in 1882 and left the business fully in Gilbert's capable hands, with young Eli Graft, now 14, and as numerically gifted as ever and also, as Gilbert had predicted, considerably better at most things than most people and learning to carry it with grace, helping on afternoons and weekends, and learning the trade with the focus of someone who had already decided it was the foundation of his future. Helen's school expanded in 1881 when the town approved a second room and the hiring of a second teacher, a young woman from Wichita named Abigail Dawes who had formal training and an energy that Helen found refreshing. They divided the grades between them, and the quality of Harrow Creek's education improved in ways the town council noticed and took quiet pride in, though none of them had the grace to note that this improvement was the direct result of the fact that Helen Quinn had once proposed expanded resources and been told to present her case to the board. Edmund Quinn's health remained mostly steady through his early 70s. He had good years and slower years, and he was in all of them present and engaged, and the fixed star of the household that the children oriented themselves to. He was a good grandfather not because he invented special activities or said impressive things, but because he gave children his honest attention and respected what they told him about the world with an interest that was not condescending. Helen and Gilbert's second child arrived in 1883, a girl they named Nell, a dark-haired, deliberate creature who seemed from her earliest weeks to be considering everything carefully before committing to an opinion, which Helen said with affectionate confidence was a recognizable trait, and Gilbert said with equal affection was being diplomatic about. Nell and Edmund Jr. were 4 years apart, which produced the specific dynamic of an older brother who was loud and curt and a younger sister who was quiet and precise. And the house was full of the productive argument between these two natures that Edmund Sr. observed with the serenity of a man who has outlived the urgency of most things. The town of Harrow Creek grew slowly but steadily through the 1880s as the Kansas frontier settled toward something more established. New families arrived. The hotel expanded. A second general store opened, to the indignation and eventual philosophical acceptance of the original proprietor. The railroad spur that reached the nearest large town 15 miles east had the effect that Helen had predicted: some growth, some complication, an increase in transient population that required the town to think more carefully about what it wanted to be. There were conversations Helen and Gilbert had during these years about the question of Harrow Creek's character, the treatment of the Mexican families like the Vasquez family who had contributed to the town's building, but found themselves standing outside certain circles of social recognition, the remnants of a system that sorted human beings by origin and complexion, and found reasons to call the sorting natural. Helen spoke about this at school board meetings and at community gatherings with the clear directness that was her oldest self, the part that had never learned to be quiet about things that mattered. Gilbert listened and agreed, and where he could act, a fair wage to the Mexican workers who came to the livery, a handshake of equal weight, he acted, without theater. It was not enough, in the aggregate of a world that had and has profound injustices running through its center like a fault line. But it was what they could bring to the specific square of the world they inhabited, and they brought it consistently. Maria Vasquez told Helen one afternoon in 1884 that her daughter, who was now 12, wanted to come to the schoolhouse. It was a conversation that had an edge of careful testing to it, the way conversations between people who trust each other but know the world does not share that trust tend to have. Helen said, "Of course she should come. I have been waiting to be asked." Maria laughed, and it was the laughter of relief and friendship together. And the girl, a composed and intelligent child named Rosa, enrolled that week and was, within a month, among the best students in her level. Little Edmund, at 10, had inherited his great-grandfather's affinity for numbers and his father's talent for horses and his mother's directness, which made him a person who was simultaneously very easy and very demanding to be around. He had decided, with the certainty of 10-year-olds who are right about themselves early, that he was going to do what his father did, which pleased Gilbert in a way he kept mostly private because he did not want to press the decision before it was fully the boy's own. Nell, at 6, had decided she was going to be a doctor, which she announced at the supper table one evening with the precision of someone reading a survey result, and the table was quiet for a moment, and then Edmund Sr. said, "A good profession. What draws you to it?" And Nell explained at some length and in considerable detail, and Edmund listened with the full weight of his attention, the same attention he had always given to the people he loved, and that conversation was the first brick in a foundation that would take years to build, but that no one at that table had any serious doubt would be built. In 1885, Gilbert and Helen bought a piece of land north of town. Not a large piece, but a good one, enough for a proper house with room for a garden and a small stable closer to the livery, and space enough that a growing family could breathe inside it without the gentle negotiation of quarters that even the most harmonious shared household requires. Edmund Quinn stayed in the house on the eastern edge of town, which was his and had been his longer than it had been anyone else's, and was the right size for a man who wanted his solitude and his visiting grandchildren in a quantity he could choose rather than one that was simply ambient. The new house was built largely by Miguel Vasquez, who had by this time established himself as the finest carpenter in 3 counties, and who worked on it with the care of a man doing something for people he genuinely respects. It was a solid 2-story house, with a porch across the front that Helen had specifically requested because the porch steps of the Quinn house had been, she told Gilbert, where she had first fully understood what she felt for him. He had looked at her and said, "On the night I asked you to marry me," and she had said before that, "The night you brought the firewood." He remembered that. He remembered how she had looked watching him from the porch and how he had thought, stacking the wood, that this was something he would do for as long as she let him. He remembered the coffee she had brought afterward, the cold porch, the ordinary miracle of her company. "You should have told me then," he said. "I was not ready then," she said. "I am telling you now." "Better late than not at all," he said. "It is not late," she said. "It is exactly when it needed to be." The house was finished in the late summer of 1885, and they moved in on a warm September evening, the whole family carrying things from the wagon in the golden light, Edmund Jr. hauling boxes, with the solemn responsibility of an 11-year-old who has decided to be useful, Nell carrying her own small bundle of things with the composure of a 7-year-old, who finds the occasion appropriately significant. Edmund Sr. helping with the lighter pieces and directing from the porch of the new house with an authority that nobody challenged, because it made him happy. That first night in the new house, after the children were settled and Edmund Sr. had gone back to his own house across town, Helen and Gilbert sat on the new porch in the September dark and looked out at the plains they could see between the houses and the trees, the wide flat dark of the Kansas country under a sky of extraordinary stars, and it was quiet in the way that things are quiet when everything is right. "I have been thinking," she said. "What have you been thinking?" he said. "About the harvest dance," she said. "About the fact that I have thought about it many times and I always come back to the same thing." "What thing?" "That you terrified me," she said. "Not because I thought you were wasting good money. I said that because it was the safest thing I could say. You terrified me because in 26 years of living, the thing I had wanted most was someone who would choose me in the full knowledge of what that meant, someone who was not frightened by what I actually was. And then you put $15.40 on a table in front of everyone I knew, and you looked at me like you already knew me, and I did not know what to do with that." He was quiet beside her. The stars did the thing they do when there are no competing lights, which is to be enormous. "I did already know you," he said. "A little. I wanted to know the rest." "And do you," she said, "know the rest?" "No," he said. "I know more than I did, but knowing you is not a thing with an end, it just gets more." She reached over and took his hand the way she had at the gate in December 1878, the way she had so many hundreds of times since, and the warmth of it was still the same warmth, still ran the same way up her arm and into her chest. "That is a very fine answer," she said. "I had 7 years to think about it," he said. She laughed. He held her hand, and she laughed in the dark on the new porch, and the plains were wide and patient around them. The years continued. Edmund Jr. grew into himself with the steady confidence of a young man who has been given both roots and room, and at 15, he was working alongside his father at the livery, with a genuine skill that Sela's graft, who still came by on afternoons to sit in the sun and watch the horses and provide opinions, declared was the finest thing he had seen come out of the business since the first year Gilbert arrived. Edmund Jr. had also, by this point, a quality his mother recognized with private pride, which was the quality of paying true attention to what was in front of him. A thing so rare in human beings of any age that it is worth noting whenever it appears. Nell continued in school and distinguished herself consistently. She was 12 when she wrote an essay about the practice of medicine on the frontier that her teacher Abigail Dawes sent, with Helen's permission, to a teaching college in Topeka, as evidence that the frontier produced minds deserving of proper education. The college sent a letter of encouragement that Nell kept folded in her Bible for years and took out periodically to read. Edmund Quinn, in the winter of 1888, had a quieter season. He was 71, and the Kansas winters had accumulated in the way they do, and he moved more carefully through the cold months and spent more time by his fire and less time at the survey table. He was not ill precisely, but he was slower, and Helen recognized in him the deliberate pace of a man who is attending to his remaining time with the same care he had once brought to his survey maps. She came to his house every day that winter, usually in the mornings, and they had coffee together, and talked the way they always had about the children, about books, about the surveys he was still doing in his mind even when he was not at the table. He told her things he had not told her before, stories about her mother in the St. Louis years, the early life before Helen could remember it, and she listened with the full weight of her attention and was glad of every word. Gilbert came with her often, and sat with Edmund in the afternoons, while Helen organized the house or corrected her papers, and they talked about horses and land, and the way the territory was changing as statehood took firmer hold and the frontier receded further west. Edmund told Gilbert one cold February afternoon that the best survey he had ever done was the one he never put on paper, which was the assessment he had made of the man sitting across from him in the first months after the harvest dance, and that the measurements had all come out right. Gilbert said, "I tried to be worth measuring." Edmund said, "You were." It was, as such conversations sometimes are, a perfect one, and both men felt it as such. Edmund Quinn died in March of 1889, quietly in his own house and his own bed, on a morning of early spring when the first green was coming back to the prairie. Helen had been with him the previous evening and had held his hand, and told him about Nell's latest schoolwork, and about Edmund Jr.'s most recent triumph with a difficult horse, and he had listened with his eyes closed and smiled. She had said good night and walked home in the cold March dark and known, with the honesty she could not turn off, that it would not be long. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee when the knock came at the door, early enough that the light was just beginning. She opened the door and it was Dr. Prout, and she looked at his face and she said, "I see," and stood very still for a moment. Gilbert came downstairs a moment later, drawn by some alertness that sleeping people have when the world has changed, and he found her standing in the open doorway in her robe with the cold morning air around her, and he came to her and put his arm around her without a word, and she leaned into him in the way of people who have built something solid enough to lean on. She cried later, privately and thoroughly, in the way she did most things, and Gilbert was there and said little and held her hand, and was simply present in the way he had always been, which was all there was to do and was the most important thing. The children grieved in their own ways, Edmund Jr. with a quiet that sat strangely on his usual directness, Nell with a considered solemnity that looked from the outside like composure, and was from the inside something deeper. They had grown up with their great-grandfather as a fixed point of their world, and his absence left a shape that took time to learn to inhabit. But the shape of the family was still there, still sturdy, still warm. The house on the north edge of Harrow Creek stood with its view of the plains and its porch steps, and its rooms full of books and horse smell and biscuit warmth, and the specific sound of a household full of people who are genuinely glad of each other. At the harvest dance of 1889, 11 years after the one that had started everything, Helen and Gilbert were there again in the October lantern light. Edmund Jr., now 15, was there with a careful propriety that suggested he was attending to a particular girl among his classmates with a seriousness that both his parents noted and said nothing about. Nell, at 11, had pronounced the whole dance interesting from an observational standpoint, which made her father laugh. When the music started, Gilbert took Helen's hand, and she took it without the moment of deliberation that had attended the first time, and they went to the floor and danced the way they always danced now, which was with the ease of people who know each other's movements as well as their own. "Do you remember what you said to me the first time we stood here?" he asked. "I told you that you were wasting good money," she said. "And I told you I had brought everything I thought I might need," he said. "And had you," she said, "brought everything you needed?" He looked at her, with the rare smile and with everything behind it that 11 years had built into it, and said, "I brought exactly enough to start. The rest I found here." She looked back at him in the October lantern light with the cottonwoods golden along the river and the music playing and the whole of their built life around them. The children, the house, the livery, the school, the friends, the graves, the mournings, all of it present in the way that a life is when you are inside it and paying attention. "So did I," she said. They danced through the rest of the evening with the full, comfortable pleasure of people who are at home in each other, and the night was cool and clear, and the stars over Harrow Creek were doing the thing they always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and under them the town was warm and lit, and full of the specific human music of people living alongside each other, which is both ordinary and, on the right evenings, entirely extraordinary. And on the porch of their house later that night, with the children asleep inside and the October dark settled around everything, Helen leaned against Gilbert's shoulder and looked out at the plains, and thought of her father and her mother and the long route from St. Louis and the harvest dance and $15.40 and the cottonwoods in October and all the Sunday walks and all the evenings and all the ordinary mornings. And she thought that a life was a thing built of exactly this. Not the grand moments, but the continuous thread running through them, the presence of one person reliably beside you while everything changes. She thought all of this and said none of it, because some things do not need to be said to be fully real, and she closed her eyes and listened to the plains and was, in the complete and unperformative sense of the word, happy. Gilbert sat beside her and felt the weight of her against his shoulder and looked out at the dark and thought that he had been right. On the October night when he had walked up to that table with everything he had in his pockets, that it was worth the chance. He had known it would be, and it had been, and it continued to be, more fully and more certainly with every passing year. He thought about a young man coming up the Kishom Trail with a string of horses and not much in the way of plans, and he thought about what that young man would say if you told him where he was going to end up, in a house he built on the Kansas plains, with a woman who argued with him about George Eliot, with children who carried both their natures forward, with a livery that was his own, with a life that was, by any honest measure, exactly what a life should be. He thought that young man would probably not quite believe it, and then he thought he probably would, because even then he had known that good things were possible if you were willing to put everything you had on the table and wait to see what came of it. He took Helen's hand. She squeezed it once without opening her eyes. The night was still and wide and full of stars, and Harrow Creek was quiet around them, and the October air smelled of wood smoke and prairie grass, and the deep, sustaining peace of a life well built and fully lived. And that was all, and it was everything.